Well, hello again, agitators. I've been thinking about maybe a nickname for supporters or fans of the Triloquy podcast. How do you feel about being called agitators? Maybe you can reach out to me and let me know. I don't know. We'll continue to workshop that. But Scott and I are in week 2 of our 3-week break before we kick off season 4. We're actually going to kick off season 4 with a conversation between myself, the Phantom, and the Phoenix from the Ilharmonic Orchestra. Longtime Triloquy listeners know what they're about and know what the Ilharmonic is. But we'll be back with that on June 8th with the start of season 4. But in the meantime, I wanted to offer another extended cut of a conversation that I had that was featured on the Triloquy podcast. So several weeks back, maybe about 3 or 4 weeks back, I spoke with Andy and Travis from the Living Earth show. We had such an incredible conversation that I wanted to be sure to share our full conversation with you so you can dig into not only some of the stuff that we talked about that didn't make it to the show, but I don't know, to give you kind of a backstage look, behind the curtain look at what some of these conversations look and sound like before they're edited down into what makes it onto the Triloquy podcast. If you're unfamiliar with the Living Earth show, I'll have their website linked in the description of this replay. So please enjoy. Scott and I will be back on June 8th to start season 4 of the Triloquy podcast with a brand new opus. But in the meantime, here is my extended uncut conversation with Andy and Travis from the Living Earth show. I'll see y'all next week for one more Triloquy replay. And then the following Wednesday, Scott and I will be back for season 4 of the Triloquy podcast. Huge thanks to everyone for your continued support. Please enjoy my conversation here again with Andy and Travis from the Living Earth show. Peace.
Don't laugh at me, Andy. I don't know that I think it's different because Andy and I, because we pride ourselves on having a multitude of different projects, maybe recreational cannabis use in the Living Earth show is the spaces that we're in is different than maybe we'd see when we're performing as Commando. And California, we've been doing regular seasons of music in the Bay Area for 12 years. I don't think much has changed during that time.
Yeah.
The Living Earth shows cannabis use. I kind of want to tread. I know that this question was thrown at me, but I kind of want to have Andy go first to.
Well, please, Andy.
Because I feel self-conscious now that I'm TMI all the time. And I don't know that that's the pragmatic way forward here. My first instinct when kind of question about the intersectionality of cannabis in the Living Earth show is to talk about the early years of the ensemble and then rehearsing new complexity.
Same. Yes, go for it.
No, I appreciate your perspective on this. I'm going to flatter you into answering this.
God. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think so the thing you're talking about is one of the things we did in the early days of our ensemble is because I was actually talking with someone yesterday about this, about the specifically kind of gendered machismo that went into our early decisions to what are we going to do as an ensemble? We're going to memorize the hardest, most complicated things, because that's what virtuosity is, right? And it was really hard. Obviously. And so we'd be memorizing this Fernie Ho piece, this microtonal one. It's really cool, but it takes a year to learn or whatever. And we tried to in rehearsal find ways to throw each other off and sort of simulate the stress of a live performance. And we would sort of substances. I think we would smoke and take a couple shots before running the set in our rehearsal space and just see if we could still keep it in
and do it late at night too. So it was it was kind of like batting with the donut on, just to to kind of impede.
Yeah,
sure.
God, it was awful. And it's one of those things that
Stinky.
but it was one of those things that was very uncomfortable, came from perhaps toxic places. And also was a little complicated because I think it made us a lot better. The other place I would go with substances though, or go ahead, you go.
No, it's just, it's really, it's fun to immediately jump into gendered machismo.
Well,
on question one, but
it's fun to jump into cannabis on question one. That's not my. Come on.
Well, I try to keep it fun, and the reason I ask is because I think the bigger point is that there are so many people who still see all art spaces, despite our different approaches to it, as stuffy, as shirts tucked in. So just seeing certain social taboos or so-called taboos
Right.
being embraced in these spaces is affirming for a lot of people.
Yes, and right, like totally, it is like anything that sort of like breaks away from the sort of like fetishization of the 19th century thing that like classical music concert halls have. Great, awesome,
Yes.
here for it. But like a lot of what we do, so in our life as Commando, we play in spaces that are kind of the opposite. Like specifically, sort of queer gathering spaces are so historically, by out of necessity, centered around substance use and substance abuse, that like that band, a large percentage of it is sober. Because to be a queer artist as a boomer or like even as an Xer, right? Like to do the sort of things that are extreme and to exist in those spaces almost required a level of dissociation and a reward for doing so, right? Like you get a lot of positive validation for doing things maybe you otherwise wouldn't with a sober, clear mind. And so for us in those spaces, it's the exact opposite. It's almost like, what is our relationship to creating cultural queer space that is not centering, and this is also like so far from cannabis, honestly.
Right.
It's like all substances and what that means for a normalization of a culture we want to make that also maybe is distinct from us personally as humans.
Yeah, but before we go too deep, so you've both mentioned the Living Earth show and Commando. You're both very busy. Let's start by carving out what exactly is the Living Earth show.
You want to take the Travis or should I?
Yeah, Andy and I have a Master Blaster relationship, and I'm going to throw this one to Master.
All right. That's not, I don't like that at all.
I do though, and I really like making you deal with it.
God, okay, who's the master now? Okay. Well, so the Living Earth show, we made it we met in grad school at the San Francisco Conservatory, and we sort of both had a shared institutional love of contemporary music, coming from like an academic background, like in percussion and electric guitar, and the summer festivals of like Bang on a Can and Banff and all that.
Right.
And we followed a pretty institutional path afterwards of like in that late O's moment of like what was like the thing they called like funk music?
The indie it wasn't indie
classical whatever nonsense.
Classical indie, yeah,
that thing, where there were like all those ensembles that were sort of like taking the entrepreneurial bent into contemporary music and like commissioning things, but it's cool because we're like not wearing all black, and or we can plug in our instruments, whatever. And so we like did the same sort of thing following that path for the first couple of years. We wanted to be an ensemble that validated our training in some meaningful way because it was really fun to play that stuff, and we spent a lot of time studying it, so we should probably like in a sunk cost kind of way do this professionally somehow.
Yeah, school is expensive, give me a job.
Yeah. And so like we started this as an ensemble, like traditional commissioning ensemble in the vein of all the other the sort of the tradition of Western classical chamber music. We'll commission pieces, even though it's for our instruments, which are guitar and percussion. It'll still be notated the same way, generally like acquired through a network that grew slowly and organically, specifically through our institutions. Like, we'll meet one person at school and then they'll introduce us to their colleague or their professor or their student or whatever. And sort of like, we'll develop a body of repertoire steeped specifically in the conservatory tradition and do that thing and exist in those spaces. And that was very quickly apparent how unfulfilling and maybe like counter to all of our values as humans that sort of pursuit was. And
insular.
Yeah, on exclusive, on purpose, all the things, right?
Yes.
And all, just, in every possible way. And so like, I think we basically changed like a couple of years in the organizational like the guiding question behind what we did is like, how can the tools of the classical tradition be used to basically make the world suck less? And in that sense, we basically were like, okay, we have this training, we have this, a little bit of like a platform at this point. Is what we do in any way useful to the people who are making art that we think is actually vital and necessary to the world and a functioning human society?
Yeah, yeah.
And like,
that idea of contemporary music, or as a lot of people say, contemporary classical, I think it can create and manifest barriers that are just as strong as the folks who do center the Brahms and the Beethoven. What is your unique approach or vision for that so-called genre 10 years in, over a decade in?
Yeah. So basically, I think like the important thing for us is to really reframe a pretty fundamental question of the field, which like I think for a lot of folks and a lot of like the way our training teaches us, it's like when you're creating new things within the tradition, the guiding question is like, how can you as an artist, as a commissioning entity, as a performer, as a composer, write the next chapter of classical music history, the chapter of classical music history that reflects, you know, our world and like tells the story of 2022 or whatever. And that question to us is still really flawed. And what we want to do as an ensemble and an arts organization, a record label, all the things that we have under the umbrella of the Living Earth show now, is like make the question, how can the tools of the classical music tradition actually be useful to artists who are making important work, period? Like, you know, whether that's a composer who does work very traditionally in classical music with symphonies, or someone who's never read music in their life but is very clearly a very, very important and necessary composer. Like, I think the issue of the field that we try to shy away from and just to like get as far away from it as possible is the idea that like, I don't know, there's a lot of institutions that'll see an important composer or someone like an artist doing important work outside of the field and be like, you know, it'd be great if that artist wrote an overture for this symphony. It's like, no, that's insane. Like, I don't want to hear that person write a string whatever, or like a chamber whatever, or like, it's our job as musicians to be a useful mechanism for important people to make something they wouldn't otherwise. And if we're not necessary, that's on us, that's not on them.
Yeah, Travis.
Dig it. Yeah, the only thing I also want to say is like tools of the classical tradition, which is something that we bandy about quite a bit, but like over the 12 years that we've been, you know, playing and working together, like we've branched out from just being a performing ensemble to being like a nonprofit arts organization. And then also now this past year, a record label. So when we say tools of the classical tradition, it isn't just like, oh, we're going to like try to interpret music like kind of with a schooled ear. It's not that. It's actually just like, okay, well, like let's get this thing that is really awesome and has been thriving in the sunshine of absolute neglect, and get whatever money we can, like to just like bring it to light. And then, you know, the logical extension of that, like this year, was also let's take part in the release of these works, since the majority of people are going to experience this music like in its recorded version now more than ever. Yeah,
and I'm all about affirming everyone's artistic expression as valid or useful, as we're saying here, in some way. But I think there's also, it's worth mentioning that this so-called classical training might not be useful. I mean, is asking that question affirming, or just saying that it will always be a use for learning music theory and 16th notes and all that sort of thing?
I mean, that's exactly one of the things about, I think, us as an ensemble that's really important to recognize. Our traditions are like, already our instrumental traditions are shoehorned into a classical music world that doesn't really, like, percussion doesn't make sense on a music, like on staff paper, it doesn't make sense. Like reading drum set notation, it's insane that was sort of pigeonholed into this, like this tradition that doesn't make sense. Yeah. Like our tradition, like our instruments, like percussion and electric guitar, both can sound like literally anything, right? Like percussion is anything you can hit. Electric guitar is any sound you can make digitally. And also our tradition as performers and instrumentalists encompasses so much more. And it's incumbent upon us as practitioners of those instruments to be able to speak multiple musical languages and draw from the vocabularies of other traditions in ways that are not like dilettantish. It's like that's what that should be. I mean, in Commando, for example, right? Like there are like, there's crossover. Like, you know, I think anytime anyone learns anything, that is applicable to anything else one does. But like,
Yep.
That's not necessarily audible. And it shouldn't be. Like, that's not interesting to anyone other than maybe like the us as academic whatevers. That's not the point.
Yeah, yeah. And when I tied that conversation and that idea to, some of your broader work and mission, folks can go to your website and see that it says, using classical music tools to foreground BIPOC and queer artists. There are a lot of folks, a lot of white people in the field who sort of feel handicapped, for lack of a better word, when it comes to engaging that part of the conversation. What has that looked like for the two of you as white presenting artists who are working, among the many things foregrounding queer and people of color artists?
I can start. And Travis, you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, because there is like there are personal components, there are geographical components. Like it's played out in really like kind of interesting and personal ways. I think like for both of us. But as always, I think that Andy, you're much more thoughtful.
That's not true. That's just
Travis is being
I always
shy
feel like
today.
when I say things, I need corrections. But like, yeah,
that's
I mean,
not true.
I think okay, cool. So in many ways, being a presenting organization in the Bay Area was really, really, really fruitful. Was that it was small enough to be able to meet people from different walks of life that were making music in different ways. And there were a lot of like being close to Mills, was like Mills College was a completely different ecosystem of performers than like being close to the conservatory or being close to state schools and the type of music that was like happening there. When we were, graduates, like, that network was like kind of built in and we were meeting people that were making music thoughtfully from completely different traditions and disciplines. So I think like the diversity of our programming, like the Bay Area had a lot to do with it, like and still continues to. Some of the other stuff, though, I'm going to have you speak to, Andy.
Cool. I mean, I think a lot of it also very much does boil down to the question of like here, like we are at this place as musicians, as artists, and as an institution now. Like, it's about the question of like, is this useful? Can it be useful? And ask like, that's like, and then asking people who are making really important work, and be okay if the answer is no.
Sure.
But like every time one works with like, and oftentimes like if that question is opened in a real and honest way, you'll get answers that really do like force one to reckon with the space one takes up in the world on a stage, as an organization, and just like as an artist.
Yeah.
And we've been sort of fortunate enough to, I guess, Travis, as you were saying, like the community of artists in the Bay really does foster a kind of connection if one looks for it, or if one's sort of open to it, or if one's like able to, yeah, I don't know. It is a special place. And in that area, we have been able to work with folks who are like, I think maybe just as listeners, being really inspired and excited by like artists who are making important work. And if you like, it's impossible to be making important work and not reckoning with the space you take up, and reckoning with how the institution works in the world, and how like it's impossible to sort of like talk about classical music and not talk about that.
And I don't know if it's just like our work practice or what it has been over the past few years, but it's just seemed really organic to me. And like I really like the fact that like when I'm trying to shoot the shit with people or ask advice, like the people I'm talking to don't look like me.
Yep, yep. And considering the diversity of the Bay Area beyond identity, I'm thinking about diversity of musical perspective and
Absolutely.
diversity of mission. What do you look for in collaborators beyond, highlighting the identity part of it?
I mean, okay, Travis.
No, I've always felt like the identity like came second, where it was just like whenever we'd be passing around SoundClouds and stuff like that, and then we'd come upon like something that didn't sound like anything else. It was just like, oh, okay. Like you would discover that they had an identity, like maybe that was something other than whiteness or cisness or whatever. But like, it's never been enough for us to like foreground like a composer or a musical thinker just because of their identity.
Right.
It's always.
And I really do honor that. And I ask the question because it's the script of so many of the more traditional arts institutions to say, well, we put the music first, and putting the music first, everything else just goes completely out the window. So I do think,
Yeah,
I,
but
I honor what you're saying.
but so much of that smacks of just like, hey, we're doing the right thing. Don't attack us. It's just like
Sure.
we're doing the bare minimum enough for you to like look away so we can keep taking the time.
Sure, sure.
And it's also meant we've sort of found ourselves artistically in like intentionally uncomfortable positions. Like, we've been as like our whiteness has been centered on stage in ways that like are uncomfortable for everyone that's like taking part in that interaction, whether that's like the audience or the composer or us. Like, our physical bodies have been used as an artistic tool, which is something that is like, once you start, like, I think like in works like that, I'm speaking of like, there's a couple pieces where like our physical bodies were like sort of centered as a focal artistic tool.
And I know the pieces you're talking about.
Well, yeah, which we can talk about in more detail. But like, once one does that, one of many points is that like and it's sort of like a silly and sort of very obvious one, but like the bodies on stage are always the focal point of what's going on. Like, It is impossible to like so much of the classical tradition is about invisibilizing the performers and sort of like being these robotic automatons that like automatons, whatever. But like, that it really does, like, the identity doesn't matter. It's like, the channeling the sort of like the spirit of Bach. That's it. Right.
Right.
And of course that channeling is profoundly racialized and gendered, and sexualized. But like, I think we, like, a lot of our works over the past like half decade have been, when we are commissioning a composer or working with an artist, it's not about just sort of like what notes are going to be on the page. It's like, what is the role of every single facet of this artistic interaction going to look like?
Yeah, yeah. But for the past several weeks on our show, we've been talking about the transformation of audiences as a part of the transformation of these spaces. When you talk about, who is the focal point, what is the focal point in the conversation surrounding that, I don't think we can leave out audiences in that conversation. So, with that in mind, I wonder if you can speak to your artistic goals as it directly applies to audiences. Are you looking for something different from an audience? What does that conversation look like?
It's super. Can I take this one real quick, Travis? Or actually, yeah. Do you mind if I take this one?
I mean, the first thing that like I would want to talk about, or at least introduce into the conversation, is like work that we've done that has actually been pointed at the audience. I mean, like in.
We'll talk about that. Yeah. Pointing works at the audience, as you say.
Yeah, I mean, just as a bullet point, I want to put that in.
Well, I think like where I'd start with that question is like, we get on grant applications all the time, like from like institutional funders, like, what does your audience look like? How how would you describe it? How do you foster it? And to me, our 100% primary audience is the composers and collaborators we work with. Like, our job is to be the best and most sort of like uncompromising platform for them to create work that they've always wanted to do, or like their most ambitious work, or the thing that they thought they couldn't.
Yeah.
And so oftentimes that is directly at odds with what would be marketable to a classical presenter or their classical audience, or even like anyone who's new to the field. Like, there's a lot of times, and we're not even talking about the works that directly antagonize our traditional audience, of which there's a lot. But like, when I'm working with someone, it's like, my job is almost to turn off the part of my brain that's like, oh, people are going to like this. Like, my role as a collaborator and as like someone who's interpreting the work of someone else is to realize their vision uncompromisingly, and then like after the fact, as administrator, we'll go back and be like, how can we spin this to be palatable across like whatever thing. But it's like, it's almost like they're two separate identities that have to be divorced from each other in order to have have work that really does feel like it's pushing things forward existing in the world. Because every time one starts to cater to what cater to what other people think, it feels like it holds stuff back.
Right.
Well, because music is so steeped in your tradition and what you expect. It's like your expectations and what you're comfortable with. And so like, and that's great. That's what makes it so powerful. It's what makes it connect so viscerally.
Yeah.
But also, if our job as a nonprofit arts organization is to like exist outside of the marketplace, is to create things that foster a certain kind of progress and like really do things that push in ways that might be uncomfortable, thinking about audience almost has to, or like, it's a separate conversation to like, but it's separate and it isn't. Like I think about audience being every collaborator we've ever worked with. Like that's who we're serving as an arts organization primarily.
Yep. And when we talk about some of these traditional structures and ideas, I feel like the very phrase classical music is a part of that. I've taken the time to listen to the Living Earth show collaborations and creations, and I'm a radical in many ways, but I can definitely make a case for what you create as classical music, depending on, considering the work I do and the way I do that. But that's just me. What are your relationships with that phrase classical music as it relates to the work that you do?
Complicated. It's changed a lot over time, where at first, it was like us just kind of like going along and being complicit with, okay, well, we're doing this in the classical tradition. And then it became this kind of very self-conscious revolt about, we'd say, we play classical music on the wrong instruments.
Okay.
And then we found that actually it wasn't really a service to the people we were collaborating with, to just fully embracing it. Like we're a classical music ensemble. Like, that's what we are. And I think that like it really makes it easier, and then to make it explicit like that. Not only easier, but it's the truth. I mean, that's how we try to treat every collaboration as if it is part of the tradition.
Sure.
I might actually disagree with you a little bit on this. And
good. Do it.
I think like, all right, I will. I think like, over time, like experimental music has been a thing that's sat a little better than classical music, in terms of what we do and how we approach it. Because there's so much of what we do as an organization that really is not classical music by any, like Commando, not classical music by any definition. And a lot of projects too that like fit a lot more as, if like improvised music or noise music are genres of music independent of classical music.
Yeah.
Those works would fit better there. They would round up to noise more than they would round up to classical music. And so like, even talking about it like that suggests a certain kind of institutional primacy that's really important for us to recognize, or like us as an ensemble to like recognize, reckon with, and like, it's useful when giving artists a platform and like a certain kind of cultural legitimacy, but also has the effect of muting what someone might do, or like might refracting their work, or like all sorts of things. And so like, it's a very, very important thing that's like a part of our artistic lives. We commission composers in a very specific tradition. We work with notated music. We work with scores. Our training allows us to rehearse and internalize music in a way that is inextricably linked from that history. However,
you're just I'm sorry, I just like marvel sometimes at how good you are at yes and.
Well,
that's the only way forward. Yes.
Thank you. But, like I think it's one of the things that's actually been a little hard for our ensemble to exist, is that, and one thing that is true is like whatever your sort of like listening habits are, whatever you enjoy, like I guarantee you we've done something that'll alienate you. Like so deeply, like there's one segment of our work will alienate you so hard, at least one, probably many. And so I think for a lot of chamber music ensembles, it's kind of like there's groups that I love, and everything they commission like sort of almost has like a red thread, whether it's instrumentation or style or like musical sort of vocabulary, and it feels like you're listening to a band you like. Where I feels like that for me. And whereas for us, it's like every album on this record label now will sound like a wildly different band. Like not even on the same instruments, not even close. Like, you know, because like our instruments are so open-ended on by design, like it's sometimes hard for a traditional audience member to latch on to us as a music fan, because they'll like, throw our like whatever we have on Spotify, throw that on shuffle, and it sounds insane.
Sure.
And
which many people would see as a good thing, on the other side.
Oh, I mean, we do. That feels essential, and it also feels sort of like antithetical to music existing in the marketplace. Which again, like our responsibility as a nonprofit arts organization is to do that. It's to like, which is also like classical music is a funny word, because like, what does that sound like?
Right.
Like,
and the reason that I push so hard for recontextualizing that phrase, because I can get down with you use the phrase noise music. I can get down with
yeah.
the word noise as a descriptor and not as a pejorative, and fostering all of these different spaces. But at the same time, I can't let a culture or an infrastructure just exist, because sometimes those things have implications that go beyond those institutions. For example, I go back and forth with how I feel about orchestras, because I feel like those artists deserve a space. But at the same time, if we maintain orchestral institutions as they've always existed, there are other implications and other status quos that we are maintaining at the same time. That's really the biggest reason why I'm so challenged by not considering more things classical and not broadening what we mean when we use that phrase classical music.
I mean, I love your podcast for 10 zillion reasons. And one of them is sort of like the red thread of discussing like what belongs in a conversation about classical music. Like, yeah. I don't know if any sort of like mainstream thing that like sort of brings that conversation to the fore, like y'all do. So that's like been just as a fan really fun to now like be a bit of a part of. But like, I mean, we have projects that like, I mean, Commando is not like what would possibly be classical music about that, other than like the fact that we have classical training, we came from conservatories. Sure. But at the same time, like we rehearse and memorize in a specific kind of way, or like I do. Like I approach, like in that project I played, I don't know how much we need to talk about like what that project is, but like my initial rules of like that project were like I had to play drums like by Brad Wilk rules, which meant like if the drummer for Rage Against the Machine, if he couldn't play it, I wouldn't.
Okay.
And which is like a fun handicap. He's a great drummer, but like would never play anything like that's not particular, like is a very specific kind of drummer.
Right.
And so like, and the majority of that band by far does not read music, has no interest in like in any discussion of classical music. That's not like even on their radar as artists and as composers.
Yeah.
And so like for us, it's like, if we call that classical music, who is that for?
Sure.
And that's a really important, and I say that just like, I don't necessarily know the answer. Sorry, Travis, go ahead.
I mean, it's interesting because it's even divided within our ensemble, right? It's like how personal, like you make that, like whether or not you want to just be a musician and then detach from that tradition, and it's like a thing that you engage in, or I guess like in my situation, I just kind of feel like it's a thing that I carry with me and try to do something I'm proud of with it.
Yeah. I want to loop this conversation back to what we were talking about a little bit earlier.
Sorry.
When it comes to, no, it's fine. It's great. With geography, my conception of the Bay Area is one that would allow for a project like this to grow and thrive, a place that's sort of weird. Again, a word, not as a pejorative, but as a descriptor. But you've been, you're well-traveled as an organization, as an ensemble. You've been to South Carolina and all sorts of other places. I wonder how geography has played a role in the development of your projects. Are you received as well on the East Coast as you are in the Bay Area?
Well, I think the first thing that geography did for us is I know we would not exist had we started in New York. We would not be doing it right now, for a lot of reasons. I mean, I think because the first couple of years we basically lived in a practice room together for probably 3-4 years, just like memorizing complicated music for a couple dozen people. And that like made us develop a musical language that like, you know, when we memorize things now, we draw from that. We draw from the moments we spent like memorizing Fernie Ho and Ken Wayno's piece and like all those things, all like these very like complicated things that are for not like, you know, that are I still think are pretty great, but like we're not lucrative decisions in the moment. And where we in New York, I know like Travis for sure would be like a very, very in demand person playing so many things like in the way like if you, I don't know how much folks know about like what the Bang on a Can festival is like and what that scene is like, but the idea that you can just play like 10 million gigs like back to back to back to back to back and like learn so much music so quickly and then do it and then sort of put it on a different hat, do another one. Like our first couple of years, we weren't doing that. We were like really getting deep into building like a musical, an ensemble based vocabulary, like for how to memorize collectively, how to cue and perform, all those things. So I think the Bay being kind of not a hub for classical music allowed that to exist.
Yeah, that's really interesting, especially considering the San Francisco Conservatory, not only the San Francisco Symphony, but the Oakland East Bay Symphony. You know, so you know, with it not being a hub, it still seems like it's an ecosystem that's really rich in not only new idea, but the traditions that so many of us try to dismantle.
Totally. Go ahead.
It was good at the time. You know, I think like some of the things that like did make it good for us were great in moderation, but like they've changed like a little bit. Particularly financial pressures. I think the things that really did work to our advantage is that like there were other opportunities for us to like play music and maybe survive a little bit, but there weren't that many. So we were always kind of like directed into putting energy back into rehearsing and the ensemble and figuring out how to do pieces that were designed to be impossible. You know, we were really able to not be that distracted, like particularly like when we were out of school and just like trying to figure it all out. You know, we always like came back to like meeting at the rehearsal space at 10 a.m. every day. And then also I think that like how expensive the city was even at the time, like also really
Much
helped
less
us
now.
too, because it really kept us on it, where it's just like, okay, like how do we, you start out and you start playing and then you want to present and then you feel so insignificant, which, you know, like to do another like kind of meta full circle, which is where I think a lot of the, you know, some of the decisions that we made that would be considered macho like came from, where it's just like you feel so small, you feel so insignificant, like you don't know how you're going to get attention and try to elevate the thing that you're doing and the people that you're playing with. So you're just like, okay, well, you know, that's where you try to inflate it, you know, a little bit, which is what I think we really like tried to do until we found like a better way of doing it. But I think it was just like a lot of that pressure, like having a little bit of financial pressure that like translated to like how do we get in front of people and how do we matter, that kept our attention on the project like in those early years.
So,
Go ahead.
I was just going to ask, you know, how do you balance that financial viability against some of the more progressive conversations that are popping up when it comes to class solidarity and anti-capitalism? Is it all about breaking even? I mean, what's your financial approach?
I mean, that's really complicated, and like it is whenever those things feel like they're in conflict directly, which I mean, they're always in conflict, but whenever there's like a direct conflict, like the money side has to lose, and that has to be so prominent. And like, we've also like, as we've built into like the ensemble into an arts organization, like those things are like, as we build a board of directors, like the importance of having like, you know, a board of directors that represents our audience and the people we want to serve and what feels like the folks we want leading the arts organization of our dreams. Like that's very rarely going to be folks whose lives are steeped in capitalism as we know. And folks who are like, you know, that's so that is a conversation that is like, but also, you know, one has to like, unfortunately, one doesn't really have a choice of like the financial system under which they live.
Right.
And so for us, there's like, I think it involves very constant reflection and very intentional, like, conversations about like what each decision means, like who it's for, how it's made, and kind of like allowing voices into that conversation we trust to guide those decisions.
Yeah.
And it's a great thing. It's just that that's where, the soul and the conscience of the ensemble comes from, is just like having everything being so complicated, and then dealing with, gross problems that like involve money in the split of it, and then having to rely upon constant consensus and compromise that I think is a real strength.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't want to end our conversation without talking a little bit about Commando, since it's been mentioned a couple times. I'm just, for the folks at home, I'm just gonna read from that portion of the site. It says, a San Francisco-based collective of queer and trans artists coming together to use the traditionally heteronormative vocabulary of heavy metal, rap, and poetry as a unified site to aggressively celebrate queerness and dismantle heteropatriarchy. I can speak to the heteronormative aspects of rap and even in poetry. I'm not so familiar with that within heavy metal, and then moreover that as a meeting place to, as you say here, aggressively celebrate queerness. I wonder if you can speak more to that.
Go for it, Travis. Do you want to start?
Okay, yeah, I think that separating the genesis of that project had a lot to do with reimagining the age of rap metal. So I think that they've already been synthesized in our mind, or in our concept was that the rap metal thing had already happened.
Well, actually, yeah. So Garrett, what were you listening to in 1999?
1999, Project Pat, Juvenile, all of those folks, the late, the early 2000s rap, basically.
Right. Were you watching TRL?
Yeah, anything whiter.
I would have to. I mean, maybe TRL will come on every now and again, but I'm thinking more of 106 in Park, and and maybe that's another conversation based on I'm from Memphis, so being in a predominantly black city, most of the things I consumed looked like me and reflected my culture. So I've never really thought about how those things play a role in things that fall outside of that blackness, if we're gonna use that language.
Sure, it's fascinating for us because I think we're probably roughly the same generation, and so 1999 2000 for me and for Travis, when we were early middle school, was that era right before Napster, where Clear Channel bought all the radio stations and nationalized the playlists, and so things does Limp Bizkit and Korn.
Sure, I've heard of them. Yeah.
yeah. Were ubiquitous in a way that a band would never be again. I think they sold 40 million albums, something insane like that. Had a level of sort of cultural prominence and ubiquity in the pop music sphere. I feel their every album they released would break some sort of record of just moving units.
And then it was also popular news at the time that this was due to Geffen was doing a pay to play policy with Limp Bizkit in particular, and it was just oh my god, it was making it plain that you could just spend money and then just and get the statistics.
And that also things like Woodstock 99, these sort of profound kind of moments that were very national news because of their sort of just horrific masculine misogyny and homophobia and whatever. That was and also this it's a really fascinating genre to reflect on, because it's also it's kind of Rage Against the Machine's fault.
Okay.
In the way that they successfully synthesized rap, hip hop, metal, and sort of funk and punk and all of these things together, and Tom Morello being what's up.
Sure. It's kind of Faith No More's fault too.
The two of them, yes, but it's a genre that diluted every single element into a specific kind of heteronormative masculine whiteness. That's just I don't know if anyone wants to go back and watch that Woodstock 99 performance that Limp Bizkit did, the headlining one that sort of famously went south real quick. And it's just seeing that many people and that sort of insane popularity, influenced me as a this is when I'm new to buying albums and experiencing music. And so a question we had starting this project was like, what if that cultural moment had been used for good instead of evil? Like, how would the world have been different? And it like it became something very, very different than that. It became basically like a project with there's two kind of like, it started with two guiding force. Like the vocalists who are basically quarterbacking a majority of the songs are Juba Kalamka and Lim Breedlove, both of whom have had unbelievably heroic histories as queer artists in not just the Bay, but the world. I mean, Lenny, his band Tribe 8 from the late 80s, early mid 90s revolutionized so many things about the space cis men take up in rock spaces. And Juba created, I mean, so many things, but I think Homo Hop and his group Deep Dick Collective as some of the first sort of out hip hop performers in the Bay and the world. Like, there's these decades and decades of history and power and like influence. And, you know, the world would be better if they were, you know, Fred Durst.
Sure,
And
sure.
so when we started working together, it like a little bit had the vibe of like revisionist history. And then it became, how can we use all of the things that we do to make something that you want to make that would be cool, would be exciting, and, you know, your ideal music.
Yeah, and this is good. I wasn't expecting to think along this thought train today, but you know, you mentioned all of these bands that I
Mhm.
definitely don't know. But with that being said, I know Korn because at one point in my life I was feeling emo and somehow got into Evanescence, and their cover of Thoughtless
Oh
is
my God.
how I learned who Korn was. I
That's
know
amazing.
I know the song Smells Like Teen Spirit because The Breakfast Club, a nationally syndicated black radio show, that's what they start with every day. I can go on and name all of these connections. So with that, you know, being said, I wonder if you have any experience creating those bridges for audiences or maybe even collaborative artists, considering the history you're aware of and the intersectional aspect of all this music that we don't always talk about.
I can do that with a personally like kind of intersectional thing where it's like I had all those $18 CDs and like I loved them. And
Hmm.
then like you don't need, I mean, like you can go back and listen to like All in the Family or something on Follow the Leader and be like, wow, that's a problem. And then so I love those records. I also grew up, you know, around transness. So like
Hmm.
having to deal with like both, I really like these CDs, and you know, like that is, you know, kind of where the joy in the project like came from. It's like, you know, when you put those two things together and try to make it right, you're like, oh, there, I fixed it.
Yeah. I mean, it also like, again, in the same way we're working with like, like any other composer, it's like, Juba, what do you want to do? Like, how can we
Hmm.
make a thing that's like, and we can sort of like we bring a lot of references to each other. I mean, not just like, well, really around every single way that we like, like grew up is so wildly different. Um,
Hmm.
and the idea of like meeting somewhere where we're able to volley these things back and forth and like create music that incorporates all of it is, you know, kind of really about trust.
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
and Juba as an artist I would trust more than any human on earth. um, God, he's so good at so many things. It's really, yeah. If you're unfamiliar with even like the early Deep Dick Collective records, they're just stunning and amazing, and his work as an author and a poet and like a organized, all the things. But I mean, for us, like, you know, we can like tell him, I think like I told him, like, sent him like the video of like Tom Morello very sheepishly admitting that he was like a sort of sex worker, like
Okay.
in college or whatever. And like, he thought it was like the funniest thing in the world. And then like, we wrote a song about it. That like incorporates a lot of other things. Like the reference, like, you know, Juba's work is references on references on references on references that are so specific to him.
Hmm.
And it's a really fun and rewarding and important thing is to like, you know, not just like allow that to exist, but like be able to share that.
So, what will signal, as we wrap up here, what will signal the completion or the execution of your mission? I know that we can say the work is always ongoing, but is
Mhm.
there a point a specific point that you're working toward, and the way that you approach all of this music and all of these conversations?
I mean, I think that's a big problem, right? Is like I think that I success, like to me, I know it's a different thing for me than it is for Andy, but success for me like has always been like the longevity. Is like however, even if like the ebb and flow of people that are attending your shows, like watching your things, commenting on your things, like I'm okay with the ebb and flow as long as there is this longevity that we've had, and I hope that we continue to enjoy. And that, I don't know if that feels goalless, but
Or just
but like
the institution of a system.
yeah, I mean
a system being put in place.
yeah, that's the thing I worship, is that longevity.
It's funny because like I think about this a lot, and especially like I have a lot of musician friends who are like working in popular music, and there's very specific metrics that are used to judge success and popularity.
That can be bought and sold,
Oh, yeah.
when it comes to listenership and all of that sort of thing, of course.
Fully. And I think like for us, and for me at least, it's like really important to not engage with that as like or like almost recognize that as a goal is antithetical to the actual goal of creating work that feels meaningful and is important and necessary. And like also being very comfortable with the idea. And this is also like is a thing from just thinking about historical music, like judging necessity and impact and influence is impossible to do in the moment.
Sure.
And so it's all, again, kind of very much about trust. Is like the people we're working with, we trust as artists, and like trust I think we trust them because they really hit us as fans. Like every single person we work with, like we're a giant fan of, and they've changed our lives in some way as listeners. And we sort of have to, you never know what's going to happen, but we sort of have to imagine that their next thing will have the effect on others that it had on us.
So go ahead.
No, I would just say that like, we prognosticate plenty. Like we really try. Like we, it's not just saying that, okay, like, which we do oftentimes in mission statements and discussions about audiences, like when we're prompted, talk about like, we're really just doing this for our collaborators, to elevate our collaborators and all that. But we do really think about it. We want it to have impact. Like we want people to see it and feel things, and we really put a lot of thought into how everything we make will be consumed and by how many people.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So is there an upcoming collaboration or recent project that you would point people to as far as an introduction to the Living Earth project and what your mission and perspective on everything is? Where do people need to start when they begin the journey of engaging what you've created?
It's funny because, well, here, Trav, you go first. Sorry.
The projects page on our website.
Sure, that'll do it. But I mean, I think also the goal of every project is to be so deep in an artist's work that like, or our collaborators' work, that like it's designed to be sort of a culmination of whatever they've been working on up to this point. And so that it feels kind of like deep in someone else's vocabulary. So I think there's not one thing that encapsulates all of it on purpose, like by design. I think the idea is like, if one clicks around, they will find stuff that is interesting to them as a listener. And also things that will be the opposite. And also like perspectives and points of view that are necessary for every human to be aware of. And things that maybe like deal with subject matter that would be less interesting to others. And so I think just like it is very tailored to, what each kind of person is looking for in their experience as a listener.